1 Samuel chapter 31. Well, as we have gone through the book of 1 Samuel, we have seen that the book really is structured around the lives of three men. Right? First, we have Samuel, who is really the last of the judges. Samuel was a great prophet. He was the one who anointed two kings of Israel, one of them being Saul, the other being David. Then the second main character of the book is, of course, Saul, son of Kish, who started out with humble beginnings, became something of a deliverer of Israel, was anointed as king, installed as king, but then enters David. And when David comes in, Saul becomes jealous of him and envious. Saul sins against the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul. And then the rest of 1 Samuel is a conflict between David and Saul. And we see the downfall of Saul. And this is the conclusion to this part of Samuel, is the death of Saul. Remember that we pick up somewhere after chapter 29, verse 11, right? So Saul had gone and seen the witch at Endor, and David found himself with Achish among the Philistines, and he was told they were going to go and fight the Israelites, and then the Lord delivered David from that. The Philistines headed to the area near Mount Gilboa, where the Israelites were, and now comes the battle. If you look at your map for a moment, you see up there at the top is Mount Gilboa, where the action is today. And you just see some of the other activities of Saul. For instance, his first campaign, he defeated a garrison of Philistines, really his son Jonathan, right? And Saul did it because he was the ruler, but his son Jonathan was the hero in that instance. But then also Saul had successful campaigns against the Moabites, the Amorites, the Edomites. He also defeated the Amalekites. And while he was pursuing David even, he had some success against the Philistines. Remember, he had to turn away. He was pursuing David, and he learned the Philistines were attacking, so he had to go and fight them. And now we come to Mount Gilboa. It's interesting, in Scripture and in world history, mountains, high places, are often have religious connotations, right? Many important things in Scripture take place on mountains. And this one is sort of the sacrifice of Saul on Mount Gilboa. And there are a lot of cultic or religious overtones to the story here, even to the point of Saul being slaughtered like a sacrifice. And Saul is being removed, and then he's going to become a trophy, right, for the Philistines. But all of this according to what God had said. And make no mistake, to the Philistines, as we see this taking place, this is a very religious struggle, right? It's their gods versus the God of Israel. They think they're throwing off Jehovah. And Saul, of course, being the king of that people, is representative of that. And so you see why they treat him so harshly, why they go after him so hard and treat him so harshly, because to kill him is to strike out at the Lord. And to be victorious over him, they and their people and their gods are presumed to be the victors, okay? But before that, we learn of the death of Saul's sons. So the way this is described, it's interesting that the subject at the beginning of chapter 31 is the Philistines. The Philistines fought hard against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. A theme in this chapter is the faint-heartedness of the men of Israel. We'll see several times how they're fleeing and being cut down while they flee, even to the point where they abandon the cities and the Philistines move into the cities. In other instances, we see the Lord stirring up men to great courage, right? And in this instance, their courage failed them, and they don't acquit themselves well on this day, and they are just routed and slaughtered. They fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Even remember what Samuel said, or the ghost of Samuel, or the witch said, or the demon, whoever was speaking, when Saul went to the witch to find out what was going to happen, and it was said that Saul's men, the men of Israel, his sons, and Saul would die. And we see this taking place now. So the Philistines then killed Saul's sons. He has other sons, but 3 of them are mentioned here. We'll meet some of his other sons upcoming. But 3 of his sons are killed this day. Among those is Jonathan. Now remember, Jonathan was a faithful man, a virtuous man. He was a friend to David. Jonathan, by appearance, should have been the next king after Saul. And Jonathan seemed to have had all the qualities that would have been suitable for a king, right? But Jonathan had to recognize the Lord's plans, and he saw that David was to be king, and he was loyal to David, and Jonathan lost out. And Jonathan oftentimes was stuck between his father, the king, and David, the Lord's anointed. And here Jonathan tragically dies at the side of his father. There's a bit of tragedy in this. I think just that Jonathan was ever faithful. Remember when Saul took a rash oath, if anyone ate the honey, right? And Jonathan had done nothing wrong, and Saul was ready to kill him. When Jonathan intervened on behalf of David, Saul was ready to kill him. Jonathan was mistreated, and yet always was faithful. He never betrayed his father. I mean, yes, he did remain loyal to David, but he actually didn't do harm to his father. And he faithfully to the end does his duty and dies at his father's side. Now we saw the words of Samuel predicting that this would happen. And so his men are dead, his sons are dead. And then next, Saul is wounded by archers. Literally it says, and the archers found Saul. Meaning one of their arrows, or some of their arrows, found him. So he's wounded by these archers. And he knows that it's a mortal wound, probably. He sees he's going to be overrun. And what is his concern? He does not want to fall into the hands of the Philistines. There's some parallels between Saul and other characters we've studied in the book of Judges. Samson, Abimelech, Gideon's son Abimelech. You remember Abimelech said a woman threw something from the wall and crushed his head. And he's like, kill me so no one says a woman killed me. And Saul is kind of like that right here, right? He would rather his armor bearer kill him than let the Philistines kill him. But also, he knows what it will be like to fall into the hands of the Philistines. And there's Samson. They put out his eyes, they mock him. And Saul is very much, it's like chess, the king, right? You conquer that piece, and it's symbolic. And so for Saul to be taken captive, taken alive, is a terrifying thing. But we'll notice the thing he's afraid of kind of comes to pass. The Philistines are not dissuaded by the fact that Saul is dead when they get there. They still have their fun with him. Okay? Now his armor bearer, he knows he's going to die, so he orders his armor bearer to kill him. His armor bearer refuses. There's an interesting parallel here with the armor bearer, because if you remember, there was a time when David was Saul's armor bearer. And David would not shed the blood of the Lord's anointed, right? He would not strike out against the king. He had fear of the Lord. And the armor bearer here too does that. David, the armor bearer, refused to kill him, and this armor bearer refuses to kill him. And so Saul kills himself. Probably not, how would I say it? Not a justifiable action, okay? Maybe there are some parallels to Samson here, who brought down the Philistine temple and died in the process. But Saul's death is less valiant. Right? Self-murder is not the same as if Saul had a grenade and he held on to the grenade until he was surrounded and took out more Philistines, that maybe would have been more valiant. But merely killing himself in order to avoid the onslaught of the Philistines is not valiant. It's a last act that speaks very poorly or looks very humbling upon Saul. I was reading Matthew Henry on this, and he says, what about Saul's soul? Right? Saul is concerned about his body, and he does not want the uncircumcised Philistines to mishandle his body. But he does not seem concerned for his soul. Now, we don't know that he wasn't concerned for his soul, but that's not what comes out here, is it? Yet Matthew Henry warns, he says, so what is the state then of Saul's soul? And he says, simply, we're not told. And the secret things belong to the Lord, and we leave it at that. I think there's some wisdom in that. Obviously, we have some reason to fear for Saul's soul. But nevertheless, his big concern is his body. So he's armor bearer then kills himself. Now that his master has been killed, he follows suit. And then there's a summary in verse 6. Saul, his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and his men. And all of this just as the Lord had said, but just again a very tragic and somber end to Saul, who was, really Israel's first king, and who had great promise, who, remember, had the Spirit of the Lord. He was anointed. He had done some remarkable things. He showed, in some instances, great bravery. He was among the prophets. Remember, he prophesied. He had Samuel. There was a lot of promise there. And one of the things that changes with Saul is he stopped listening to the Lord, and then the Lord stopped speaking to him. And then Saul kept seeking out information, right? He tried to find the Lord's will, but when the Lord spoke to him, he didn't accept it. And so then he did dumb things like consulting a medium, right? And remember, he did things like, killed the priests of Nob. And it was because of his decision to do that that the surviving priest went to David and brought him the ephod. And then David was receiving word from the Lord, and Saul was not. All right, so there's the death of Saul. Any questions or comments? Yeah.
I just thought, go back to the beginning when you were saying the battle between the Philistines and the Israelites is over their gods. And I really think that people today don't understand the Old Testament as well, because to them, everything was about their gods. It was always a battle.
Yes.
Whose God was stronger. They were very much more aware.
Yes.
And I mean, the battle is still the same.
Yes.
But we've just dulled it and
Yes.
taken it away by we kind of removed gods from lives.
Yes.
So we really, I think, miss a lot of what's really going on in the world. The battle between God and evil.
I think I've mentioned this before, but Rudyard Kipling has a poem called The Gods of the Copybook Headings. And he's talking about gods, obviously, like, religious gods, but also the things that tie people together, okay? Heritage, religion, history, traditions, common morals, etc. And they don't go away, but we pretend that they do, right? And so we look at the world today, and we've been trained not to see that religious component to our struggles, or not to see that there are ethnic or racial or geographical or historical reasons for conflicts. Those strong gods, or the gods of the copybook headings, are there. And we've been conditioned not to see the world in that way. But make no mistake about it, when Hindus put up a Hindu statue in a city in America, that's very religious, okay? That's very religious. And it's a shame to our nation that we have this great idol. It shows that, wow, God's hand of judgment is really on us. We've really forsaken him to the point that now we have a foreign idol erected on our soil, right? Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
It makes me think, so it was Dr. James White, he had the quote in a debate he was doing, and he said how his opponent said, when he's talking about traditions, he said, I don't have any traditions. And to which he said, well, the man who says he doesn't have any traditions is probably the one who has the most traditions.
Yeah.
Because you're so blinded. I think it was Van Til that talked about looking through rose-colored glasses.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we're, culturally, when you're dealing with those issues, and I've had a lot of conversations like this where you bring up a point and there's a biblical perspective and people start to kind of give pushback, especially other Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes it's because we're looking at the situation through a filter that's not Scripture.
Yeah.
And it's easy to feel justified because you might have good logic in terms of how you're building your conclusion, but the foundation is either going to be God's Word or something else.
Yeah. And the framework that we adopt, right, what we think is normal, we almost can't help it. We're born into it. We live in it. It's suitable and comfortable to us. It's normal. That's one reason why I do think it's helpful for us to read some history, church history, history of other nations, etc., because it removes us from our own time period. And, we're fighting our struggles today. And there's going to be things, people 100 years from now look back on us and like, what were they thinking? Why did they do that? That was silly, right? And we do that. We look back, 100 years ago and we think, what were they thinking? And we are stuck in our time period. And sometimes we need to look at, and so something like this book, 1 Samuel, we see the struggle with the Philistines and think of Achish. Achish is this Philistine king who really is at war with God's people. Yet Achish was more just towards David than David's master, Saul. There's an irony there, isn't there? But what if the world actually works that way? Right? What if the world, it actually works that way, that men are motivated by things and behave certain ways because of those things? It's helpful to think about that. All right, any other questions? Yeah, Bob.
Well, I was just going to, again, not a question, but just going to comment and say, although we don't have a special status in the United States like Israel has, Israel kind of is a model or paradigm that we can use and other nations can use.
Yeah.
And I just thought, I can think of leaders we have. Some of them are like Saul. Some of them are like Jonathan. And we wish we had more leaders like Jonathan than we do like Saul. But and I think that's the thing we have to see, that even in our nation and other nations that have there are scores of nations that have some kind of Christian heritage.
Yes.
Of one kind or another.
Yep.
You see this mix of people being faithful and people being much less faithful, and sometimes totally disregarding the truth that they know is there.
Yeah.
And I think we need to see that in our leaders. That's sometimes we're being led by Sauls and sometimes we're being led by Jonathans.
Yep.
But the principles that we need to follow are the same.
Yeah.
Whoever's leading us.
Yeah, that's very good. Israel was a particular nation, and so they had some unique laws and arrangements because God was working out salvation history, right? But there are universal principles that applied in Israel, and those same principles apply to every people. The scripture says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, right? Whoever fears the Lord, that's good for them. And also, as you pointed out, we're going to see men like Saul. We're going to see men like Jonathan, and oftentimes it will be the men like Jonathan who will be unjustly treated. They will not be received well. And this is sad, but it shouldn't be surprising. Look at how the world treated Christ. Right? He never did ill to anyone. He only did good. He was the wisest man, the most righteous man, the brightest, everything. And he was mistreated. And we'll see that until he returns, right? Doesn't mean we have to like it, and doesn't mean we shouldn't oppose it, but we have to be realistic and know sometimes it's the bad men who seem to gain prominence in a society. All right, so we see again in verse 7 the flight of Israel. So there's the men of Israel, the men of Israel, the men of Israel, and there's really three groups of the men of Israel. The first are those who are with Saul, okay, those on Mount Gilboa. And then there are those, those are the ones who are slain. They flee and they're slain on the mountainside. But then there are those who are looking at the battle or around the battle. They're on the other side of the valley and they're on the other side of the Jordan. And so when those first men are slain, when they flee and they are slain, these others see it and they lose heart. And then they flee. And this is something to note about cowardice, is that it's contagious, right? When we see our brethren fail, we lose heart. And that's what happens here with the men of Israel. They just, so the cities, think about what's in the cities. It's their wives and children. It's their family members, right? It's the land that God gave them. And because they're afraid, they leave those cities and the Philistines move in. So it's a cowardly act, right? They fail because partly they see their leader and the men who are supposed to be fighting for them, they see them, those men fleeing, and their spirits are broken. And they just run away. And remember at the conquest, Israel was supposed to come in and settle the land, to dwell there. This is their part. Part of it is by faith, live in the land, right? By faith, you live here. And you expel those other people, and you live here because God has given you this land. And it's supposed to be a type of heaven. And so when they leave this place in fear, they're sort of giving up on their inheritance. And so it's a very negative thing for Israel to do. And so now you've got the Philistines dwelling in these Israelite cities, which was the exact opposite of what their commission was. And then in verses 8 and 10, we see the Philistines found Saul. So it's the next day. After the fighting is all done, they come and find him, and they see him dead with his sons up there on Mount Gilboa. It's just mentioned almost kind of matter-of-factly. It says, so it happened the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain. As if, as one does, right? When after a battle, you go in and you pilfer the dead. And this is, very, very normal for Philistines. But then the way that they abuse Saul receives a lot of coverage. So they find him and they, of course, cut off his head. And later on, there's going to be a question like, where is Saul's head? Because it goes all over the place. It's kind of like, do you remember Goliath's head? And we're like, where is Goliath's head? Right? David cut it off and he brought it to Saul, and then he put it behind the ephod, and right. And so later on, we're going to find like, where is Saul's head? Because it travels around.
It's like the NFL or no NHL trophy.
Trophy. Yeah, where is it? Yes. It gets passed around. And Saul is a trophy, okay? And they strip his armor, and they proclaim it. The word proclaim is similar to our evangelize, okay? It's this is a good news to them. We have defeated our enemy, right? Our gods have been victorious. So they're sending it around preaching their gospel, right? And they put the stuff in the temple of their idols and among the people, and everyone looks at it. And this is a big celebration and good news to them, because Saul, he's slain his thousands, right? He's been a thorn in the side of the Philistines. So they put his armor in the temple, and then they fasten his body to the wall at Bethshan. Let's see, I think I have on here a map. Yeah, on the back page, on your last page, there's a smaller map there, but in the middle, you see those squiggly lines. That's the clash of forces right there around Mount Gilboa, and there's a valley and a river, and that river, if you follow it to the east, you find Bethshan. There's the city of Bethshan, and that's where the Philistines pinned Saul to the wall, his body, and of course his sons. And it's, again, a trophy, right? This is their way of showing that they've been victorious.
It's interesting that Jonathan, who was a pretty big, supporting character, had very little told about his death. Mm-hmm. But then also he was faithful, and then he has the same fate as his father, who was not.
Yeah.
It's hard, like you said.
Yeah. Yes. You think of a tornado or a hurricane that moves through an area, and maybe 1,000 or several hundred people are killed. And amongst that mass of people, there's all these individuals, some of them righteous, some of them wicked, and they all die on the same day and apparently the same way. And it would seem like, the righteous and the just, they all go to the same place. But that's not exactly true, is it? For Jonathan, he went to eternal reward, and for Saul, perhaps not, right? And yes, it appears that Jonathan found the same fate as Saul, but that's only if you don't see more, right? And what is Jonathan's name? What's his reputation? He was a faithful man, and that is his name is good. Saul's not so much, right? And it would seem that that they both had the same end, but not really. Yeah. All right, now there's these men of Jabesh Gilead. By the way, let's just talk for a moment about. So the Philistines are having all of this fun with Saul's body, his corpse, right, and his armor and all these things. And as Christians, we understand that the body is not ultimate, right? That's not the only concern. We have a body and a soul, and the soul lives forever. But the body is part of man, and it should be treated decently. We shouldn't, mutilate and pass. We should have some decency, even with enemies. Now, maybe, I don't know, we saw David cutting off Goliath's head and using it as a trophy, so I don't know, maybe we have to understand that there's some goodness in that. But generally speaking, we should have some regard for human bodies, right? And that's partly why we have things like funerals and burials and things like that. There's some somberness. We treat the body with some respect, because even though the soul is no longer with it, that is part of that person, and that person is in God's image. Therefore, we give them some respect. Not so much with the Philistines, but that's who they are. Now, these men of Jabesh Gilead, there's a little background to them. Remember, in the book of Judges, the Benjamites committed sexual immorality, they went to war with the rest of Israel. And then, as they went to war with them afterwards, the people of Israel realized there was one group of people who was not there to fight against Benjamin, and it was the men of Jabesh Gilead. And it seems like the men of Jabesh Gilead always had a soft spot for Benjamin. And so then the people of Israel went in and killed a bunch of people in Jabesh Gilead, And then they later on felt bad for the Benjamites because they had no wives. So they went in and stole wives from Jabesh Gilead and gave them to Benjamin. Very weird things, right? But there's a connection between the people of Jabesh Gilead and the people of Benjamin. Where was Saul from? He's from Benjamin, right? There's a connection there. But there's also another connection. Remember there was, what's his name, Nahash, the Amorite, who was going to, he was sieging the people of Jabesh Gilead in chapter 11. And Saul came and rescued them. And it was one of his most, one of his highlights. And he rescued the people of Jabesh Gilead, and they have not forgotten that. Okay? So they come in then and they retrieve the bodies. They heard what happened, so they travel all night long. It's like 10 or 11 miles, if you see on your map. So we saw Beth Shan. If you go to the east and the south a little bit, you see Jabesh Gilead on the other side of the Jordan River. So at night, they travel 10, 11 miles under the cover of darkness, recover the bodies, and then return. So it's a 20-some mile round trip, and not a small thing, going into a Philistine-occupied area. And it's kind of like if you've all seen the movie Black Hawk Down, in which a lot of the movie centers around trying to recover the bodies from the helicopter crash. And people are dying and taking great risks merely to recover bodies. And that's what, so these men of Jabesh Gilead, that's what they're doing. So they took the bodies, and then they burned them. There's all kinds of speculation about this, and I don't know why, but it seems the most obvious thing to me that they are doing is they're ensuring that the bodies are no longer available as trophies, right? They're ensuring that the Philistines don't come and dig the bodies back up and put them on the wall again. So others are saying, it's been a little time, the bodies are starting to putrefy, etc., and so they burn them so they don't get sick. And I don't think that that's likely the case. I think this is a matter of dignity. They're trying to preserve the bodies from being further abused. So they burn them, and sometimes this is used as an argument in favor of cremation. But I hope you see that the circumstances here aren't really, it doesn't really favor that. They're doing this as a matter of necessity, right? Not as a matter of what is preferable. What would be preferable is Saul and his sons would have been buried in a grave like most Israelites, and that would have been the end of it. But because the Philistines have this habit of pinning them to the wall and separating their appendages from them, they burn them so that they can't do that. And then they bury the bones under a tamarisk tree. Saul, remember, was sitting under a tamarisk tree. We get the scene of him sitting on the tamarisk tree and his spear in his hand. I think that's a kind of a hearkening back to that. And then the men of Jabesh Gilead fast for 7 days. This is mourning. They are mourning Saul. So even though Saul, was a villain in many ways, to someone, he was memorable enough and heroic enough that they mourned his death. Any questions about anything? Yes, Tom.
Just, I guess a comment on the similarities in the beginning of Samuel and here we are at the end, right? So the Lord's anointed Eli and his sons sort of die on the same day.
Yeah.
The Lord's anointed Saul and his sons sort of die on the same
Yeah.
day. Right after that, the ark is captured, so they think that they have God where they want him, and they put him in their temple, and now they do the same with, Saul's body in the same kind of sense, thinking that, once again, they got Jehovah on the run.
Yes.
Those similarities at the beginning of the book and the end here just seem too close to not mention it.
Yes. Yeah, you're right to note the similarities between the death of Eli and his sons and Saul and his sons. And seeing God's hand in it all, right? Seeing that God is the one who's doing these things, and the Philistines, when they captured the ark, as you mentioned, they thought that meant victory. But what did it bring them? It brought them trouble, right? Because God is not mocked. And we'll see what happens now going forward with the Philistines, right? Obviously, the removal of Saul is not going to be the end of this for them.
Rick, I was
yeah.
just going to say too, when Ray was preaching on this, he was making the point that Saul was really considered a great military leader.
Yeah.
I mean, he built the kingdom, and
Yeah.
so from people who aren't looking at it from a faith perspective per se, Saul was a great king.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, I often wondered, think of the Apostle Paul, and his Hebrew name is Saul, and he was a Benjamite. And I thought, who would name their kid Saul? Right? But to your point, from a certain point of view, Saul was a good king. Right? It's maybe from a military perspective, a secular perspective, a governing. There was something about Saul in the mind of the Hebrews that made it worthy of passing that name on, even in the first century. It's bizarre to us because maybe we look at the story of Saul a little bit differently, but in the minds of some people, Saul was not entirely a tragic figure. Yeah. Excellent point, yes.
In regards to your comment about the cremation thing, it made me think of, dealing with family members who have, used that as justification. Seeing it in context, what's going on, it's not really a prescribed, but a now what type thing.
Yes.
And
yes,
I don't think
yes.
I've ever thought of it in that way, actually sitting in and reading through it and all this stuff. They weren't like, hey, let's do this. This is what.
Right.
And on
right.
top of it, they still buried the bones. They didn't put it in an urn.
And
on their
scatter it
mantle, or scatter
right,
it
yeah,
some
yeah.
special place
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
dead person. But it's oh, okay.
Yeah.
I've not ever been able to explain or not defend, but help walk through that.
Yeah.
And,
Yes. Yeah, and it's, just on so in the Greek heroes, like in the Iliad, I think there's a common thing where they make funeral pyres and burn the bodies. And for them, it was, that was the right ceremony, right? They practiced that. And I have no doubt at times that the Jews did similar things, and maybe for similar reasons, but it was never what would have been prescribed for them, right? That was not the Christian burial.